Good evening. We can get started. My name is Warren Klein, and I'm the curator of our Bernard Museum here at Temple Emanu-El and a team member of the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center, and I'm very excited to welcome you to the continuation of our collaboration with the Medici Archives in Florence, a research center that collects and combs through thousands of documents that allow us glimpses into the lives and culture of Jews of early modern Italy. We are thrilled that our guests have finally been able to return for this series of 3 lectures about the Jewish community of Old Florence. During the pre-COVID years, some of you might remember, they led us through the old ghetto of the city. They helped us to understand not only the contribution of Jews to the advance that was the Renaissance, but also the backlash as well to the anti-Renaissance. And before we had to deal with an epidemic of our own, they provided us a glimpse into how Italian Jews coped with what were regular occurrences. They even led us on an amazing journey across modern and early modern Italy, a trip few of us will forget. Tonight, they'll pull back the curtain on the daily lives of Jewish merchants at the time of Grand Duke Cosimo III de' Medici in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And just a reminder, tomorrow night they will discuss the complicated legal peril Jews fell into, whether they committed minor or serious crimes, as they were caught between the Florentine judiciary, the Holy Inquisition, and the rabbinical Beit Din, the Jewish court. And on Thursday, they will introduce the man who defied the stereotype that Jews were not painters and produced still lifes, portraits, and landscapes at the Medici court at the end of the 17th century. Our distinguished guides are Dr. Alessio Assonitis, who has worked at the Medici Archive Project since 2004 and became its director in 2009. He has published extensively on Italian Renaissance art, Medici history, archival studies, and digital humanities. And Dr. Piergabriele Mancuso, who joined the project in 2013 as director of the Jewish History Research Program. He is also coordinator of the Ghetto Mapping Project, a research initiative to reconstruct the architectural, economic, and demographic features of Florence's Jewish ghetto. If you have questions, we'll invite you to come up to the microphones at the end, and it's my pleasure to welcome our guests. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you, another Warren, Warren Haber and Sue Ellen Haber. Thank you, Gadi, my friend who's at home, I think with back pain, and Erica, of course, who is somewhere around here. I can't see her. During the next 3 evenings, we will tell you a story that consists of a constellation of different public, private, and secret stories. We will tell you about the twilight of a very powerful Italian ruling family, a dynasty, and more specifically, about the struggle of an aging monarch to protect his own family history and to preserve his future legacy from an inevitable demise. At the same time, we will tell you stories about a powerful and silent community. Today, we will call this a minority, a community that flourished and suffered under this dynasty, and whose principal focus was to survive the immediate present, a minority that in many ways had no concrete Tuscan past, or no concrete past, of course, aside from a biblical one, and whose future was always unsettled. You will be reacquainted with glamorous individuals, the Medici Grand Dukes, the Grand Duchesses, their children, their artists, their scientists, their doctors, the lawmakers. And you will also learn about individuals whose existence has been ignored for centuries, the Jews in the ghetto of Florence. We will present you unpublished archival documents, digital reconstructions of lost buildings, colorful paintings of animals and fruits and exotic plants, recipe books, images of banquets, descriptions of battles, and copies of early modern newspapers. In the next 3 evenings, you will also hear about religious bigotry and cuckoldry and violence and prohibition and bans and creativity and blasphemy and scientific discoveries, patronage, technology, financial investments. Most importantly, however, you will see the product of research, of scholarship, of the importance of primary sources, which is the principal mission of the Medici Archive Project, an American research institute based in Florence, which I have the privilege and the honor to direct. But before we dive into the final chapter of the Medici dynasty, we must go back to 2016, as Warren just mentioned, when Gabriele and I came to the Streicker Center, at the time was called Skirball Center, for the first time. During the course of 6 lectures, we explored in great detail the unique relationship between the Jews and the Medici from the late Middle Ages through the end of the 16th century. In our first meeting, we presented an overview of the significant presence of Jews and Jewish culture in the Medici archives. Since Cosimo the Elder, the founder of the Medici dynasty, this presence was pervasive and widespread. Jews were active in a great numbers of areas, not just medicine and finance, but also diplomacy, art, collecting, science, technology, astronomy, everything. Letters to and from and about Jews arrived in Florence from all corners of the world, from Northern Europe to the Far East, from the Americas to Africa, recording Jewish life and experiences previously unknown. But Jewish culture had a strong cultural presence also in Tuscany. Florence was the epicenter of humanist thought. Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola and Poliziano were part of a circle of scholars who, under the aegis of Lorenzo the Magnificent, rediscovered and regalvanized Greek culture by situating it within the context of contemporary philosophy, literature, and science. We came to the Streicker Center to illustrate how Talmudic scholars and Jewish thinkers played an important role in the creation of this cultural phenomenon, with their contributions on Kabbalistic thought and Jewish mysticism. But Jews were not always welcome in Florence, despite establishing themselves in the city sometime in the Middle Ages. In 1495, they were expelled by the Dominican friar Fra Girolamo Savonarola. From the pulpit of San Marco in the Florence Cathedral, he voiced his hostility towards Jews, specifically with regards to usury. The irony was that Savonarola would enlist rabbis to teach biblical Hebrew to his friars at San Marco, and that his project of reform, of religious reform, of a Christian city, of a Christian paradise on earth, consisted in transforming Florence into a new Jerusalem, a holy city without Jews. It is safe to assume that whenever the Medici were in power, the Jews found a relative safe haven. With the restoration of the Medici in Florence in 1512, after 18 years of exile, many Jews returned to their neighborhood, what used to be called Via dei Giudei, in the Oltrarno, on the other side of the river, on the other side of the Arno in Florence. In the next 50 years, Florentine Jews managed to carve out their own space within the social and commercial fabric of the city. One of their great supporters was, of course, Cosimo I. And let's be careful with the Cosimo. Eh? This is Cosimo I, who was elected duke in Florence in 1537. In one of our lectures, we unraveled the Jewish mercantile and information networks that proved instrumental in the construction of the newborn Tuscan duchy. Merchants, travelers, and astrologers from all over Italy served as informants for the Medici in exchange for patronage and privileges. Among them was Jacob Nunes, or as is known in Italy, Jacobillo Ebreo, a Sephardi Portuguese merchant, art dealer, and spy, whom Cosimo in his letters called amico. And these two are the two articles that Piergabriele Mancuso wrote about this Jewish spy, Jacobillo Ebreo. The Jewish dynastic superpower that stood out in Ducal Medici Florence was the Abravanel family, or the Abravanel family. Originally from Spain, they arrived in Florence from Naples with Eleonora of Toledo, the wife of Duke Cosimo. This family comprised of rabbinical scholars and community leaders and bankers and diplomatic intermediaries and financial brokers, some of whom operated on behalf of Duke Cosimo himself. His wife Eleonora de Toledo, was known to spend time discussing religious matters with her lady-in-waiting, Benvenida Abravanel. Alessio. The climax of this lecture series arrived when we presented for the first time our research on the Jewish ghetto in Florence. Built by Cosimo in 1569, 1570, the ghetto was located only a stone's throw away from the Duomo, from the cathedral, and from the baptistry. The necessity to construct a Florentine ghetto, or a ghetto in Florence, arose not so much to segregate such a growing and variegated community, but as a means of incorporating and ultimately protecting it. By the end of the 16th century, the ghetto became a vibrant crossroads for information, material culture, and scientific knowledge. Demolished in the 1880s, we were able, at the Medici Archive Project, to reconstruct this building thanks to the copious, and I mean copious, documentation that we were able to find in the Medici archives. As you can see, or if you remember from 3 or 4 years ago, we try to cover as much territory as possible. Tonight, however, we will not revisit the Medici in the golden age of humanism and banking, the Florence of Cosimo the Elder and his grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent. Nor will we revisit the dynamic career of Cosimo I, Duke and Grand Duke of Florence, who founded the modern Tuscan state after years of civil turmoil and bad government. Nor will we revisit the accomplishment of Grand Duke Ferdinand I, Cosimo's son, who consolidated the Tuscan state by transforming it into a European superpower, albeit for a very brief period. In the next 3 days, we will explore Florence in the forgotten centuries, to borrow a title from a well-known book on the Medici. More specifically, Florence in the second half of the 17th century and the first half of the 18th century, a period that is hardly known, to the wider public at least, for its splendor and for its magnificence. Indeed, the rule of Grand Duke Cosimo III and his son, Grand Duke Giangastone, marked this twilight, marked the end of the Medici dynasty, which would become extinct in 1743 with the death of Anna Maria Luisa, the last Medici heir. This lecture series will be completely devoted to Jewish life and culture at the time of Cosimo III. Tonight's lecture will be devoted to the everyday life of a Jewish merchant around the time of the enlargement of the Jewish ghetto, which took place in the first decade of the 1700s. Tomorrow, we will be addressing Jews and the law from 3 different perspectives: Jews in the Florentine judiciary, Jews in the Inquisition, and Jews in the justice system within the Jewish community, within the rabbinical aegis. And finally, on Thursday, we will present the life and works of a Jewish painter who was born, who lived, and died, pretty much, we think, in the ghetto. In order to properly contextualize this period of Florentine history, it is imperative, and I really mean imperative, to understand who Cosimo III was and what happened during his rule that brought the Medici dynasty to an end. And most importantly, how did this affect the growing Jewish population in Florence? Cosimo III's personality, I should say actually personalities, can be best described by these 2 images. In fact, this entire lecture series is marked by these 2 contradictory attitudes. Attitudes that will reflect strongly on Florentine Jews, mostly in a repressive way, with some exceptions. I'm asking you to keep in mind, to think about these images during this talk and during the next 2 days, if you come and watch the talks in the next 2 days. They're very important. In the first image, we see the young prince dressed in elegant clothes, riding on a horse. This is a drawing, by the way. This is a preparatory drawing for a painting mentioned in the Medici inventories, but it's now lost. I mean, I don't want to stress on the obvious similarities with the two Medici equestrian statues in Florence, Cosimo I and Ferdinand I, bronze statues that embody political and military power. With this work, my intention is to point out to you Cosimo's leisure and mobility, even though the horse is holding one leg up as if he is engaged or it is engaged in dressage. The handsome young prince seems distracted by something, almost curious about something happening on his side. In the other work, executed more than 40 years later, Cosimo, now Grand Duke of Tuscany, is depicted in ecclesiastical robes. One can even glimpse St. Peter's Dome in the back of the painting. In another version of this picture, he seems to have put aside in that picture the Grand Ducal crown in favor for the biretta, the ecclesiastical hat, which he is proudly holding with his right hand. Cosimo III, born in 1642, grew up in a dysfunctional family. And growing up at the Medici was not always dysfunctional, by the way. His grandfather Ferdinand, a student of Galileo, was an avid amateur scientist and collected a great number of technical instruments, barometers, thermometers, telescopes. He shared this passion with his brother, Cardinal Leopoldo, who later founded the scientific society called the Accademia del Cimento. The two also established the Biblioteca Palatina in Palazzo Pitti, which constitutes the core collection of the holdings of the National Library in Florence today. Cosimo's mother, on the other hand, was a profoundly religious woman and made sure that Cosimo and his brother Francesco Maria received a strict pious education. Archival sources describe her as extremely austere, especially when manifesting her faith in public. But Vittoria was also someone who indulged in courtly pleasures. For quite some time, she has been dismissed as a bigot. But in recent years, scholars have been assessing her artistic patronage, which was noteworthy, by the way, and as was her role as a diplomatic broker and benefactor. Needless to say, her marriage to Ferdinand was an unhappy one. And also the fact that Vittoria caught her husband in bed with the Roman Count Bruto della Molara did not make things any better. The couple became estranged for more than 15 years. They literally never saw each other before they had another son, Francesco Maria, who became cardinal, as was the custom at the time for second-born males. Cosimo grew up surrounded by priests and by his mother, and spent many summer holidays visiting convents and going on pilgrimages to Tuscan holy sites. I like this picture of the mother and Cosimo and a tutor, which almost looks like a holy family. He was an awkward, sulky, helpless boy who was known to collect bizarre animals and deformed plants. By the way, this was very common in the 17th century, and to be honest, it's something that that a lot of people did at the time, including the Medici. And this, by the way, evolved into a much more fully fledged scientific interest. His tutor, Volumnio Bandinelli, that's what his name was, known to form popes rather than princes. Hardly into hunting or riding, as was the Medici tradition. All Medici males were all both into hunting and riding. At 17, he was described by an ambassador as being dominated by melancholy and as never, ever laughing. They never saw him laughing once. Cosimo's life would radically change, and not for the better, with the arrival of his new wife, Marguerite Louise d'Orléans. This was, of course, an arranged marriage. Marguerite was a cousin of King Louis XIV and granddaughter of Maria de Medici. She arrived to Florence in 1661 after spending time in the exciting courts of Paris and Versailles, filled with music and balls and theater. So if the marriage of Cosimo's parents was horrible, his own marriage turned out to be a real nightmare. I mean, I cannot think of one portrait of the two of them together. Even during the marriage negotiations, Marguerite wanted nothing to do with the future Grand Duke of Tuscany, since she was initially promised to the Duke of Savoy, and was infatuated by the Duke of Lorraine, with whom she had a secret affair. After a triumphal entry into Tuscany, these are the festivities for the wedding, Marguerite soon realized what a dismal situation she was stuck in. The high-spirited and flamboyant French princess hated Florence, hated the constant presence of priests at court, as well as the rigid customs, and detested her husband and the influence that his mother had on him. Not only did the two did not get along, they literally could not be in the same room for more than a few minutes. A few minutes, of course, were enough to produce 3 children: Ferdinando, known as the Gran Principe, Anna Maria Luisa, and Gian Gastone. The last offspring of the Medici dynasty, and we'll get to this point later. Prossima. Prince Cosimo needed a break, and here we go back to this image. His overbearing religious alpha mother, she was still alive, and his rambunctious French wife were way too much for his meek and passive personality. The only way to escape this deadly grip was to get out. And indeed, he got out as quickly as possible and for a long time. Between his marriage in 1661 and his elevation to the Grand Duchy of Tuscany in 1670, Prince Cosimo embarked on 3 major tours, first in northern Italy, then in northern Europe, and finally in Western Europe. Of all these trips, we have exhaustive records and archival records. We have travelogues, we have letters and drawings and account books. For the first time in his life, Prince Cosimo was living at large, spending money, buying art, meeting people, visiting courts, university, cathedrals, printing presses, markets, collections, country villas, and sanctuaries. Cosimo, who was fluent in French and Spanish, but loved England, was curious about the world. And this curiosity about the world would emerge in a different way and in contrast to his religious zeal once he became Grand Duke, as we shall see in the next 3 lectures, especially tomorrow and the next day. During these extended journeys, he found time to attend a performance of Molière's Tartuffe. He made a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. He inspected the ports and industrial plants of Amsterdam and Hamburg. He lost himself in the botanical gardens in Leiden. While at Oxford, he attended lectures on philosophy and mathematics, including a heated debate on Galileo's doctrines. Among his most delightful pastimes was spending time visiting collections of oddities and curiosities. Even when he returned to Florence, he could not wait to get out from the Medici court. He really hated being there, as when he visited the religious sites in the Casentino, which is the area just northeast of Florence, with an entourage of 30 people. Even during this brief trip, he was able to connect with the roots of Tuscan spirituality and with his subjects, who gifted him, who gifted the prince with livestock and food and wine. But this joyride, so to speak, was soon over. Cosimo became Grand Duke shortly after returning from his second European tour in the late 1670. During his absence from Florence, his relationship with his wife worsened. Marguerite would belittle Cosimo in public every chance she got, and once she became Grand Duchess, she laid claim to her portion of power. She was constantly reprimanded by the Florentine court to such an extent that her restlessness was made public through a small pamphlet which was distributed and disseminated among courts in Europe. Despite the intervention of Louis XIV and of Pope Clement X to try to restore domestic harmony, she returned to France in 1675, where she retired in a monastery, only to leave shortly thereafter to partake in the exciting life of the Parisian court. The two would never meet again, nor would she see her 3 children that she left in Florence again. It should be said, and I'm concluding, that Cosimo, when he became Grand Duke in 1670, he inherited a financially precarious state from his father, Ferdinand II. Florence barely recovered from the devastating plague of 1630, 1631 that had decimated the population. This is very important. The Jesuits were gradually taking possession of the offices of the public administration, as well as of a significant acreage of Tuscan territories. The intrusion of the ecclesiastical authorities within the urban fabric reached its apogee with the institution of the Inquisition in Santa Croce, right, which will be discussed tomorrow. What almost completely drained the Grand Ducal coffers were the wars of Castro against the forces of the Barberini Pope, Urban VIII. Ferdinand bankrolled these military campaigns, the father of Cosimo bankrolled these military campaigns, accruing gargantuan debts with mercenaries. All these things had inevitable domestic repercussions. The naval fleet was gradually being dismantled. The wool and silk industries, once major sources of income, suffered tremendously. Taxes were levied, and the cost of maintaining the Grand Ducal court were reduced, despite the fact that they were very exorbitant no matter what. Now, I want to go back, and before I pass the microphone to Gabriele, to these two images, because these two images will mark, in many ways, today's lecture, the continuation of this lecture, and the next two lectures. The Curious Prince and the bigot Grand Duke. The man opening himself to the world on the right, and the complete self-absorption and involution of the Grand Duke, the same person 40 years later. This dichotomy, this paradox, will play an important role in determining the final days of the Medici dynastic power. And also, as we shall see shortly, it will have an impact on Jewish life and culture in Florence. I want to leave this to this because today I introduce Cosimo III, and tomorrow we'll go more in depth in the rest of his life, the rest of his career, which is, again, a dichotomy. The very religious person, the very bigoted person, and the person opening up to the world, the scientific, the intellectual. And this dichotomy, this paradox, is key, again, as I said, to understanding, the life, the culture of Jews in Florence, but also the artistic production, the scientific production of Jews in this period as well. Thank you.
Hello? Hi, it's working. Thanks a lot for coming today. It's great to see you once again after 2 years. The last time was 3 years ago before the COVID, when the world was simpler than today. It was slightly better than today, I would say. And it's a great emotion for me to be back to New York, to meet you, to meet new friends and old friends especially. And thanks, Alessio, for these, I don't want to say introduction, it is more than an introduction, these are beautiful backgrounds. When I have to do now the decorations to speak about what it meant to be a Jew in the Ghetto of Florence. Sorry about my PowerPoint, it's not working properly. I don't know, just a second. While waiting for these, for my PowerPoint, te pareva non funziona. No, it's not. Is it working? Just a second. Okay, great, fantastic. So I would start, in order to explain what it meant to be in a ghetto, I should start from the beginning of the ghetto, from when the ghetto was established by Cosimo I in between 1569 and 70. But since I do like paradoxes, and I follow the Talmud that says that sometimes it's better to begin from the end and going to the beginning, misof davar lekad muto. I like to begin today our story about the ghetto from the end of the ghetto, when the ghetto was demolished in the 1880s. Why am I starting from the demolition of the ghetto? I'm starting from the demolition of the ghetto, from the destruction, the rubbing out of the ghetto, for a simple reason, because in the 1880s, the idea of ghetto as a marginalized area started becoming a widespread concept also in Italy. And it became a central concept in order to justify the demolition of the Ghetto of Florence and other ghettos in general in Italy, like the city centers or many cities in Italy too. So I would start from this architect, Giuseppe Poggi. He was in charge of demolishing 80% of the ancient city center of Florence. If you come to Florence today, what you see around you, with exception of really a few buildings, churches and baptistries and whatever, what you see around you, 80% of the city is a 19th century reconstructed city. The rest of the city center, the historical Gothic, medieval, Renaissance city, was completely demolished, erased, removed. For a simple reason, in 1865, Florence became one of the capitals of the United Kingdom of Italy, or Unified Kingdom of Italy. You know, Italy became a unified country in 1861. So the first capital was Turin, then the second capital was Florence. In order to make the city more modern, more Italian, more fashionable, the city center had to be removed. This is the plan. Imagine that the city center is, the historical city center is the gray area. The plan was including all the blue areas and the arrows. So it was a huge urban plan aiming to renew the city, to make it more modern, more similar to other Italian cities, like Turin, like Rome, or Milan at the time. So the plan was really incredibly devastating the city center. If you look at the detail of if you look at one of the details of the city center, you will see in this map, which is something very credible, only the black spots, only the black building were spared from this demolition plan. And the ghetto was part of this demolition plan, has to be demolished. Why had this to be demolished? If you can see here reconstruction of the ghetto as you can see today. The ghetto was part of the central of the city center. Well, really a few minutes from the baptistry, was a few minutes from the Medici, the political Bari Center, the financial Bari Center, the financial district. What today is Piazza della Repubblica, at the time was the Market Square, a very popular trading center. So the ghetto was in the middle of these devastating urban plan. In the 19th century, I would say since the beginning of the 19th century, Florentine Jews had already left the ghetto. The ghetto was gradually abandoned by the Jews since the mid-18th century. Unofficially, of course, at the beginning, because the ghetto was abolished by the French occupying forces or liberation forces, depends, officially in 1808. Okay? But since the second half of the 18th century, a lot of Jews started living the ghetto, living outside the ghetto, illegally, of course, but, as a matter of fact, leaving the ghetto and transferring themselves and the families outside. In 1864, they started the building of a new temple. Was no longer called a synagogue, but a temple following the Northern European reform model. They built something that looks like a church, that is called nowadays in Florence the Basilica of the Jews, with a dome competing, a beautiful dome competing with a Brunelleschi dome, competing not necessarily in terms of size, but in terms of beauty. Depends on what you think about it. But, the demolition was obviously something that was welcomed by the local Jews and Italian people in general, but was firstly opposed by foreign scholars. The mayor of the city, Piero Torrigiani, was literally bound by articles, letters, private public letters written by foreign scholars, suggesting to maintain the city center. The city center meant Renaissance buildings, medieval Gothic buildings and churches, very beautiful frescoes and statues and whatever. This has to be demolished, according to Torrigiani, because the city was too old, was too ancient, too unfitting the Italian model. So what happened? He paid for a local administrators to make a photographic campaign, a survey of the city center while demolished. And this photographic campaign showed a city that was decadent, creepy, stinking, small. Torrigiani was so engaged in such a campaign that even enrolled a number of writers, journalists like Giuseppe Piccino, also known as Giarro, was daily writing articles about the necessity, the need to tearing down the buildings and to especially the ghetto, and he was somehow copying other writers, writing the same things in southern Italy, for instance, about Naples and Milan, where these ancient buildings and houses had to be removed in order to also to elevate the condition of the sub-proletarians living in the city. He enrolled some writers like Carolina Invernizio, a very, I would say, super boring writing writer who wrote a lengthy novel, too long novel, called The Orphan of the Ghetto, slightly anti-Semitic, depicting the ghetto and the Jews living in the ghetto as sort of animals, spiritually inferior because they were living in a very decadent area. So the ghetto has to be removed also to improve the situation of the status, the spiritual status of the Jews in the ghetto itself. So the campaign, the photographic campaign started in 1880, basically at the same times of the first demolition works. And what you can see here is a sample of the photos. The photographers were asked to take photos of the buildings, dark, gray, small houses, small streets, overcrowded places. So in some cases, the photographs were edited. What you can see here is the courtyard, the butcher courtyard, one of the main courtyards of the ghetto. On the left side, you can see a normal photograph of the butcher courtyard as it was, and then you have an edited version over here on the right side. You can see there is a policeman gazing at the photographer, and behind him there are two bandits, two men fighting each other. Obviously, this was made in order to convey the idea of a ghetto as something dangerous, and an area had to be removed to be cancelled. However, what happened? At that time, in addition to the photographer, together with the photographer, there were a lot of painters portraying the ghetto as it was, more objectively. I would say, paradoxically, while photographers had more objective technique in order to represent the ghetto as it was. So with a photo that couldn't be edited unless you put someone on the back of the police person, fighting each other, or pretending to fight each other. The painters were painting something completely different. It was colorful. It was not that decadent. Was not that, a bit naive maybe, but not such a terrible place. So we have Borbottoni, who was making watercolors of the ghetto internal, especially the internal places, like here, the main square, the butcher courtyard. You compare these butcher courtyard, the image with the other two. You can see here another version. This is another place, another square, of the ghetto. Then you have Dante Mattani, another painter, was making watercolors. Very often these watercolors or canvas were commissioned by foreigners in love with the ancient city that was going to be demolished. So what happened? We started the survey. As Alessio said, we started, studying archival papers and maps and documents until we expanded our, survey, and broadened our analysis so as to include also iconic sources. In this case, watercolors and paintings, mostly, but not 100% stored in national art museums. And we came across a series of watercolors, in this case by Riccardo Meacci, who went inside the ghetto, and he started representing every single corner, as the Medici had done in order to map the ghetto with their own maps done for cadastral purposes. What you can see here is just a glance. We found more than 40 watercolors done by these artists, but we came across this beautiful internal space of the ghetto. I was a bit stuck and a bit shocked when I found these watercolor, because for many years, for long, I would say since the watercolor was produced in the late 19th century, this watercolor was totally ignored by the historians. In one case, in an article, I found an author saying, Meacci represented an internal space of a Jewish house in the ghetto, but certainly this was not a Jewish house. It was a Christian house that someone refixed or decorated later, and maybe when the ghetto was no longer a Jewish area. I don't know why this happened. I don't know why is this judgment, but what we have in front of us is something very interesting. It's a beautiful house. It's a very nice house. It's fully decorated. Beams are decorated. We have stuccos. We have balconies. We are a lot of colors, okay, they couldn't be portrayed, represented with a photo, of course. But then I would say that these, what you have in front of you is something that is totally compatible with a description done by an historian, a local historian, Guido Carocci, who in 1886 wrote a description of the Ghetto of Florence, as the artist had done before. But in this case, he wrote saying something very interesting. Some of these houses had been well preserved. They were decorated with stuccos and nice paintings with various scenes and subjects from the Old Testament. Of course, it was a Christian writing about the ghetto. What happened then, after a few years that we have forgot this watercolor, and while we were studying the maps of the ghetto in order to reconstruct the ghetto virtually, as Alessio said, I think we found 99%, 100%, we identified these watercolors as the house of a Jewish merchant living in the ghetto. We identified not only the position of the house, but also the number of places of this house. This is the house of Solomon Levy. What we know about Solomon Levy, and why we are speaking today about Solomon Levy. Solomon Levy is a sort of a normal inhabitant of the ghetto. He's not a super poor person. He's not a sub-proletarian or very poor Jew, as stereotypically we think was a Jew in the ghetto. Not all the Jews in the ghetto were poor people, okay? There were a lot of middle-class people living in the ghetto, even though the ghetto was a decadent place, but economically, financially speaking, the inhabitants of the ghetto were not that poor. In this case, we have someone who is not only so poor, but apparently quite rich, well off. We identified the house, and we identified the details of his, sorry about it. Okay, look at this house, that's absolutely astonishing. It's a 4-floor house, located in the north and southern side of the ghetto here. That was considered the most precious, the best part of the ghetto. This part of the ghetto was done by Cosimo III in 1704, when, with a motu proprio, with a document that he wrote by himself, he forced the Jews living in the ghetto since the end of the 17th century to re-enter the ghetto. In order to make this re-entrance, he had to build an additional area. So the second ghetto, the so-called second ghetto here in yellow color, was more recent, better in terms of conditions, in terms of architectural features, okay? So the house of this person is absolutely not a small house. We found many, many houses in the ghetto. We are speaking about 18th century maps, where we have a single room with 8 people living in the same, in the same area, with maximum double room with 10 people, sometimes living in 2 families living in the same apartment. In this case, we have a very huge apartment with a lot of rooms. We counted them. We tried to identify every single section. What you find is 11 bedrooms, 3 rooms, 2 living rooms, 2 kitchens, 1 barroom, 1 covered lodge, 1 terrace, 2 bathrooms with water heating system, wine cellar, underground. So it's nothing speaking to us about poverty or decadence. It's a huge apartment. We reconstructed the apartment virtually. Now is the beginning of virtual reconstruction. As you can see here, it's a really huge apartment. It's a beautiful apartment. It's an apartment looking, facing the Archbishop House. So when Solomon Levy or his family members were opening the windows, were gazing at the Archbishop House, probably also the Archbishop himself. This is another image of the apartment reconstructed. And this is a video. We tried, it doesn't take so long, but imagine to be inside one of these rooms and looking around you, okay? We also try to follow all the different rooms and to see all of them. It takes more than 5 minutes to see the entire apartment. So it's a very beautiful, huge, I would say, house that somehow is demystifying the idea of the ghetto as a decadent poor place. Once again. Now, what was he doing? Solomon Levy was a merchant, was not a trader, was not like a Livornese Jew traveling, or buying goodies and selling goodies from other places. He was living in the ghetto, but he was a leader of the ghetto. He was a wealthy man, and as a wealthy man, he was in charge of many things. So the house of Solomon Levy is inside the ghetto, in the southern side of the ghetto, okay? But he had many, business interests around the city. He was the co-owner of a number of shops all around the ghetto, but outside the ghetto, co-owned with Christians. As a Jew, he could not own real estate officially. Unofficially depends, but officially he had to declare that the shop that he was running was co-owned with a Christian. We don't know exactly how much he was official or unofficial, but we have evidence. We have found evidence in the document that he was co-running, co-administering these shops, selling, especially, mostly textiles and cottons. So he was buying cottons, raw cottons, people from Livorno, from Jews living in Livorno, and selling it in Florence as raw cottons or textile. Okay, but as I said, he was a well-off person, and as an influential person, inhabitant of the ghetto, he was also supposed to contribute to the life of the ghetto. Let me tell you very briefly what he was doing, basically his normal daily life. He was waking up in the morning as a member of the Italian Jewish community, the Italian nation. Okay, he was supposed to go to the minyan every day, and we have evidence. We found letters, we found documents, we found trials where he was asked to go and to be part of the quorum, or the male quorum, as in traditional Judaism is required. So he was member of the Italian Jewish community. He was one of the sponsors of the Italian synagogue, in this case. You know, the Italian synagogue was located inside the ghetto, was not recognizable from outside. I think many of you went to Italy, so the historical ghettos, the only way to spot a ghetto from outside was the windows. So in the ghetto of Florence, there is a building with 5 windows. Okay, that building is the Italian synagogue. Okay, so what we can find here is a virtual reconstruction of the ghetto. We took all the maps produced by the Medici. Remember, the ghetto was a property of the Medici, was supervised by the Medici bureaucrats, and described textually and also with maps, you know, every 40 years. What is really astonishing in our case is Salomon Levy was such an influential person that he could afford to buy a sort of a balcony in the ghetto, in the synagogue. Not only a bench or a seat. This is the women area, okay, as usually done in our Orthodox synagogue. In our case, we found that there was a section that he bought, literally not rented, that he bought inside the synagogue, where his family could stay together, male and female members together, to assist to see the service. So on the same level or women area, he bought a sort of a room, a balcony, or a lodge, depends on what we want to call it, where his family could stay together, irrespectively of the male or female division, and to see the service. So Salomon Levy was such a, I would say, strong enough to influence even the rabbis and to make an exception to the rules. So which is really, really unusual in Italy. Okay. Behind the synagogue, there is a very important room called the Massari Hall. What is the Massari Hall? Massari means the political leaders of the Jewish community. Remember, in the Florentine ghettos, there were 2 main nations, okay, nazioni, the Italian and the Levantine Sephardic nation. The most important was the Italian Jewish community. More important in terms of money, in terms of influence, in terms of political connections, of course. As a member, as a political leader, political representative of the Italian Jews, he was also part of the judicial system. We will see tomorrow what it means to be part of the judicial system. He had to be able to judge co-religionists involved in legal cases, or mostly civil cases or penal cases, depends. Now, before going to the detail, let me show you a reconstruction of the Italian synagogue according to our sources. This is quite philological in terms of colors and in terms of items. And as a political member of the Jewish community, he spent most of the time, of the daytime, dealing with the Medici authorities based in the ghetto. Inside the ghetto, as an enclave, imagine there is a sort of a national enclave in Florence, there was an office of the so-called Scrittoio delle Regie Possessioni. What was the Scrittoio? The Scrittoio was a branch of Medici administration in charge of supervising and controlling the ghetto, politically speaking, and also in terms of money and finances. So he was dealing daily with these bureaucrats who had an office right in this corner, in the very center of the ghetto, and he was trying to combine, to deal with in terms of taxes, how much they have to give to the state, in terms of rents they had to pay forcibly to the ghetto. So this is the ground floor of the ghetto. Let me spend just a few seconds about this ground floor. This is really interesting because the ghetto of Florence was located, as I said, in the very city center, in the heart of the historical city center. How could this be conceived? How could be done? How could you put the Jews permanently inside in the heart of the city? Cosimo I, suggested by bureaucrats living at the time, said, okay, the only way to create a sort of an insulate area inside the city center is to create a buffer zone all around the building of the ghetto. giving the external building, facing the external spaces to Christians, okay, and giving the internal spaces to the Jews. So the Ghetto of Florence per se was a sort of a contradiction, where Jews and Christians were living together, separate according to the rules, but, sharing the same blocks, okay? So the scriptorial offices were based in here, in this corner. This is the Italian synagogue, the Sephardic synagogue, or Levantine synagogue. The butcher shop, this is really interesting. There was a butcher, selling kosher meat internally inside the ghetto as a Jewish area, but then selling the prohibited parts of the animal to Christians. In this case, just transmitting the meat to the other side of the shop and sell it to Christians. We found evidence, we found penal cases involving Jews and Christians working in this butcher shop, guilty of, exchanging meats with each other, which is prohibited. Now, Solomon Levy was a well-off person, was a political leader, was a trader, was a merchant. He had a shop co-owned outside the ghetto, but he was also a talented scholar, I would say. As a member of the Italian Jewish nation, he was also in charge of a confraternity. He was also supposed to help to create a social welfare state inside the ghetto. What are the confraternities? Confraternities are volunteer groups created by people living in the ghetto. There are different confraternities, each one in charge of contributing to Jewish life inside the ghetto, sort of a microcosm. There was a foreign ministry or a health system. It's outside the ghetto. Okay, was done by Jews living in the ghetto voluntarily. He was member of confraternities in charge of providing young people with books and sources to study. We found a book, beautiful Mishnah, published in Amsterdam in 1648, that he owned, and then several other copies that he bought for the boys' school in the ghetto, and presumably also for the rabbinical academy in the ghetto. In this case, in this page, we have, you can see at the front, typical, a maseket, a tractate of the Mishnah, but then we found the censored passages. So Solomon Levy, as someone who was able to read the text, was also in charge of, censoring the book before in front of the church authorities. Remember, every single book produced or studied in the book had to be approved by the church members, Inquisition, authorities, and he himself was removing the passages from the Masechtot, from the various tractates of the Mishnah. Now, he was a member also of the internal secular courts, judging Jews in their, litigations. What it meant, in 1620, the Grand Dukes granted the Jews living in the ghetto juridical and judicial independence. What it meant, they were free to rule over Jews who had problems with each other, to implement new rules, and then to impose old rules. That is quite exceptional, I would say. We haven't found something similar in other ghettos in Italy. There was a sort of juridical and judicial independence also in the ghettos of Florence and Modena and Mantua sometimes, but not at such a level. We will see tomorrow what happens with these Massari tribunals or, courts. What you see here is a page written by Solomon Levy. This is really interesting. There is a legal question about the oath. Imagine that he had to be able to codify and to go to the final decision following this process. Someone was asking a question about the oath. How should we do the oath? In more Hebraico, according to our rules, or according to the Christian method, whatever, Then what happens? In order to find a solution, every single judge, in this case Solomon Levy, had to go to the sources, to the rabbinical Talmudic sources, to see what the Talmud and the Mishnah says about the oath. Then he was writing down the most interesting, important passage, then translating into Italian, then implementing the Mishnah of the Babylonian Talmud, or rarely the Yerushalmi Talmud, with other commentaries, in this case the rabbinical commentary on the Talmud, and Geonim and Tosafot, additional commentaries, translating these commentaries into Italian, and finally to come to a decision that has to be done in Italian, in order to solve a litigation between, two or more Jews living in the ghetto. So it was such an easy play to do. So Solomon Levy was a very talented scholar, I would say, was a merchant, successful merchant, but was a normal inhabitant of the ghetto. So when we think about the inhabitant of the ghetto as someone who is, suffering poverty and physical, inferiority or something like that, it's, in some cases it's true, but in not all the cases, especially in Florence. Now, as an influential member of the Jewish community, he was also allowed to play cards, for instance. It was given exceptional, privileges. We found it in 1742, he was given the privilege by the rabbis to play cards and other games, okay, betting money. Why is it so important? Well, because playing cards and have a social life has to be administered by the spiritual authorities. Playing cards and, betting money could be very dangerous. It could lead to mixing also with Christians. So only those who were reliable, responsible, were given special permission to play cards and do other social things. What it means doing social things. This is really interesting. We found many, evidence of many things concerning sociability in the ghetto. What it meant, playing cards, going to listen to a play, for instance, but also listen to music. What we found is a series of fragments, musical fragments produced and done in the ghetto. We don't know exactly who wrote this music, when it was produced. I presume it was done in the late 16th century, around the beginning of the height of Baroque music. The style is quite Baroque. We found this fragment bound in the same volumes produced by the Massari, by the secular judges, of the Florentine ghetto. We have evidence of, instrumental music being done in the ghetto. In this case, we have, I don't know if you're familiar with music, but we have corrente, canzona, giga, balletto, okay, all dance rhythms normally used, played during the dances. So was this music played during one of the gatherings of the Jews dancing together as the rabbi had recommended to do according to specific rules? We don't know exactly. But what we know is that, Jews in the ghetto were in love with music and were copying, as, was normal at the time, external music. We found an oratorio, an opera done in the ghetto. We have found 12 fragments. We haven't yet understood who wrote this music, but we will find it quite soon, I would say. This oratorio / opera, what is it? It's a sort of an opera, as you know what is an opera. It's a sung story, okay? But what is really interesting of these fragments, we found double lyrics, serious and like funny opera, okay? Opera comica. This is one of the surprising things of going inside the archives. Solomon Levy is not essentially a stereotype figure. It's something that until today was totally unknown. Historians for a long time spoke about the Ghetto of Florence like the ghettos of Italy, but especially about the Ghetto of Florence as a very, dark place inhabited by poor people, unable to find their own way, unable to interact with the majority, suffering poverty, and that only with the unification of the country in 1861, they were allowed to become full citizens and to become sort of a full human being somehow, expressing their talents and potentials. What we found, in my opinion, is totally different. We found evidence, we found documents, depicting something totally different. Someone who is a high middle class person, learned, able to deal also with the Christian majority, with a strong Jewish background, able to also to go to the Talmud, to the Mishnah, to translate, okay? And then also to have a social life, rich, full, with a beautiful house, and perhaps inviting people for parties and social things. Thank you so much.
If there are any questions, I'll come down since I don't see anyone. If there are any questions, I will, yes.
If I understood you correctly, it seems as though most of the Jews located in the Florence ghetto were really Sephardim who came from Spain. Am I correct?
I would say, sorry. It works. No, well, it depends on the time. Most of the Jews living in the Florentine ghetto were Italian Jews, Italkim, coming from central Italy. I would say there were two nations, two groups. One was the Sephardic Levantine. Levantine is quite a misleading term used in Florence to define Sephardic Jews. Sephardic Jews in Florence were, numerically speaking, less relevant than Italian Jews. Italian Jews, until the end of the ghetto, were more influential than Sephardic Jews. It was like vice versa. In Venice, for instance, or in Livorno, for instance, Italian Jews was a minority, also less powerful than the Sephardic Jews. In our case, Florence is a sort of unique situation. Most of the Italian Jews, numerically speaking, demographically speaking, they are Italians. They follow the Italian minhagim, the rituals, Italian Jewry. The Sephardic group is smaller, economically, financially not that powerful, even though they had connection with Livorno, and Livorno was a super powerful Jewish community following the Sephardic rite, and coming mostly from the Iberian Peninsula. Sephardic Jews in Florence were not so influential, not so, I would say influential. Their own synagogue was smaller, more modest than the Italian synagogue.
Okay, now I assume that there must have been political connections between the reigning monarchs of Italy and those of Spain. And the Spanish became very intolerant of the Jews. What do you think was the reason that the Italians were much more accepting and tolerant toward the Jews?
It's a very complicated question. I would say that's super complicated. We could spend hours and days and weeks speaking about that. I would say Italy is a sort of merciful country. We never did so straight things, for good or better, depends. And I would say Italian people, I don't want to speak about Italian people in general, depends on the places. In the south of Italy, anti-Semitism became, mainstream and sort of mainstream in the 16th century. And then there was a revival, waves of anti-Semitism in Italy. There was an historical level and acceptance of the Jews for many reasons. Italian Jews, let me go to the point. Italian Jews are, in Italy, 100% Italian. Ethnically speaking, I would say, I don't want to speak about ethnicity, but in terms of physiognomy, an Italian Jew is an Italian, is not detectable. Or, there are no, evident differences from another Italian, a Catholic Italian. So I would say that from this point of view, it's difficult to spot an Italian Jew because the minority was extremely mixed. You know that Italian Jews were the most ancient diasporic community, dating back to the 2nd century before, the Common Era. So the mixing, the interaction started long before even Christianism. So Roman Jews and Italian Jews were, mixed and facing each other for a long time. Of course, doesn't mean that they were, a peaceful living, coexistence, as you know. There were a lot of, depending on the time, depending on the situation, depending on the state. Anti-Semitism was a recurrent, problem, okay? But I would say normally we have an interaction that started long before even Christianism and the reasons why you are anti-Semitism. I know that I haven't answered your question because your question is extremely important, extremely complicated. But thanks for your question, anyway.
Yeah, hi. Roughly, what was the population of Florence at this period and then of the Jewish population in the ghetto?
Yeah. So when the ghetto was established by Cosimo I, in the whole of Tuscany, there were 711 Jews exactly. We know exactly. In 1569, a bureaucrat that was, put in charge of, who was put in charge by Cosimo I to count the Jews living in Tuscany, with the exception of Livorno and Pisa, the two mercantile cities. In the whole of Tuscany, every single town and village, there were 711 Jews. Those who were forced to enter the ghetto in Florence were 454, and the rest, the other 200, were moved to Siena, where another ghetto was established almost at the same time. So 450 at the very beginning of the ghetto. At the height of the ghetto demographic, there were less than 2,000 Jews. the old population in Tuscany, you have to count 2,000 Jews in, at the time of demographic, the peak, 2,000 in Florence, maybe 400 in Pisa, maybe less, 300 in Siena, 1,000, less than 800 in Pisa, and maybe 5,000 in Livorno. Okay, so we are speaking about, how much is it? 7,000 in the whole, more or less, yes. Sort of a tiny minority, yet, but much more than today in proportion. Much more than today. That's for sure, yes. Sure?
Sorry, we need a
Scusa.
Sorry.
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 Was there a counterpart to the Medici family in Rome which had the Roman...
Okay. Sorry, people online can't hear you.
Thank you. Was there a counterpart to the Medici family in Rome which had the oldest Jewish population in Italy dating back to the Romagnol Jews? And in reference to the Jews living in Florence, how long were the Jews in Rome already living at the time of the establishment of the ghetto?
Oh, the Ghetto of Florence, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, good question. I don't know exactly in terms of numbers. To be honest with you, the only thing I can tell you that Jews living in Rome were not that happy, because long before the establishment of the Florentine Ghetto, in 1555, the popes, established a Ghetto of Rome, following the Venetian model, but tailoring according to their needs. I haven't spoke about the Roman Ghetto, but the Roman Ghetto was set along the Tiber River, okay, one of the lowest part of the Tiber, undergoing floods every time. So the Ghetto of Rome was a theological ghetto, as I said more than once. It was a way to show the Christians that the physical sufferance of the Jews was an epiphany, manifestation of their own spiritual inferiority. So in that case, the ghetto is a place and a method of teaching Christians, not only of punishing the Jews because they are infidels somehow. I don't know how many Jews lived in the Roman ghetto, to be honest with you, but I suppose something like initially some thousands,
And would Josephus have lived there in the Roman Jewish ghetto?
Yeah. But then many left the state of the church, coming to Tuscany. We found letters, even long before I joined the map, the Medici project. Our Alessio and other fellow colleagues found letters where the Medici are asked whether they have to accept these refugees coming from the state of the church or not. And these letters are really touching. They're speaking about families leaving the state of the church and coming to Tuscany, asking for shelters, and protection. In many cases, they were not that tolerant. Say, okay, living over them under the rain, that's fine. Doesn't matter. They are Jews after all.
But with all of these ghettos in various cities, could the Jews go and live elsewhere, or they could travel just for business and needed specific passes?
Oh, good.
Can you repeat the question, maybe?
Yeah. Then we have another. What should I do?
Maybe just if you want to repeat her question.
Okay. It's another very super complicated question. The Jews were traveling.
The question is, could Jews travel from one ghetto to the other, and did they need a passport to travel from one place to the other? Could they move and live in other ghettos?
Yeah. Well, they could move. Well, we found evidence that people were traveling, but especially for family purposes. The business is not normally done among ghettos. The Jews are traveling. They leave the ghettos to travel, to buy goodies and to sell goodies. They can, for instance, we know that Jews in the 17th century, they could leave the ghetto of Florence, for instance, with special permissions called passports or safe conducts, okay? And then go to other places, but especially other external places, extra-Italian places. There are a lot of people, marrying religionists in Modena, in Ferrara, or in Venice. They're going over there for family purposes. They could travel, according to, a lot of limitations and according to rules and according to many norms. But I would say the idea, this is the paradox of the ghetto life. While the ghetto life is a life, in a place where they have to live forcibly day and night, these tiny minorities are making local connections among each other. So we have spots all over the peninsula. And these spots are much more connected with each other than, than Christian spots. I would say a Jew could be more mobile than a Christian in the early modern period. That's for sure.
Well, actually, that touches on the question I was going to ask. Is there any documentation of communications between the Jews in the ghetto of Florence and, say, Sabbionetta at the same period, or Mantova, where music was being developed for the court in Mantova, and other communities north in the Veneto?
I would say no, but no, because I haven't found it. To be honest with you, that is one sort of a smoking gun I would like to find, one of these days. I haven't found, evidence, clear evidence, sure evidence that there was a connection between, connection not only in terms of impersonal terms. We found letters coming from Bologna, coming from Constantinople. We found Charlotte Chuvot, questions and answers, and among rabbis in different cities. But leaving them aside, they belong to the normal administration of the ghetto. I haven't found, links dictated by specific needs or importing things coming from other ghettos, like Salomon Rossi's music could be, or something, the double choir done in the Venetian ghetto in Florence. I haven't found that, but it doesn't mean that it existed. Remember, the history of the ghetto of Florence was told until a few years ago, only in terms of the making of the ghetto and the destruction of the ghetto. There are two main works. Stephanie Sigmund's, groundbreaking book about the making of the ghetto. Before it, there was a 1917 book by Umberto Cassuto, rabbi in Florence, about the Jews and the Renaissance in Renaissance Florence. But what is in between these, the making of the ghetto and before the ghetto, and the demolition of the ghetto, until today has not been told, and now has not been studied. So 17th century Florentine Jewry is a big question mark. What is it? Salomon Levy is a known name. Until today, nobody knew about his house, nobody knew about his life, nobody knew about his own shops. It's a sort of premiere today. But it's premiere because nobody, dig down properly inside the archive until we started a few years ago.
Yes, I was going to ask you, when exactly was the Florentine ghetto established under the Medici or before the Medicis came to power?
Good question. Now, the ghetto was established by Cosimo I at the end of his, I want to say at the end of his life because he died a bit later. It was established by Cosimo shortly before he was granted a Grand Ducal title by the Pope in officially September 1570.
And what was the reason for establishing the ghetto? I mean, the Roman ghetto was sort of very anti-Semitic, right? That was under Paul IV, I think.
Yeah.
What was there a particular reason that the Medici established the ghetto?
Yeah. We have two hypotheses. We don't have, an answer to your question. We have two historiographical hypotheses, sorry. One is that Cosimo wanted to align with the church, wanted to become, a proper, ruler. He wanted to gain the Grand Ducal, before establishing the ghetto, he was a duke, just a duke. With the establishing of the ghetto, we don't know exactly if it's because of the making of the ghetto, but soon after the making of the ghetto, he became Grand Duke. Was it a way to repay the church for the Grand Ducal title? It's an hypothesis where we haven't found evidence, historical evidence. The other hypothesis is that he wanted to somehow to control the territory more directly. So while the Jews were spread all over Tuscany, living, together with Christians, becoming friends and, sharing the same spaces, in many cases even sharing modern spaces, okay? He had to adopt more modern, more cogent way of controlling these people. After all, remember, the Jews in Tuscany, it's a minority spread all over Tuscany, so separated sparks, but they maintain strong ties with each other. And this seems to be unusual, inexplicable to a Christian ruler. Why are these tiny, group of families spread all over Tuscany maintaining strong ties? Why they don't group each, in a single spot and then they create a big community? That is something that is not acceptable according to the early modern, Italian political rules. So it's an hypothesis, but we don't know exactly. The third hypothesis, they wanted to make a business. He made the ghetto, but he owned the ghetto. So when he owned the ghetto, he bought the ghetto from Christian, he bought the block where the ghetto would be established, and then he forced the Jews to pay the rent and taxes, much higher rents than the rest of the city. So was he doing a business? I don't think it was the primary reason to make a ghetto. I think that it was more interested in pleasing the church. But then he turned the ghetto into a real estate business also. Thank you. Yep.
Well, I'm sort of embarrassed to admit that I'm quite possibly the dumbest person here tonight on this topic. So I'm kind of overwhelmed by the amount of information that I'm getting. So at the risk of offending you, could you sum up in a couple of sentences what you'd like me to walk out of here knowing? Because I really do feel like this is the advanced course, and I missed the first 2 years.
Okay, got it. Well, summarizing 2 sentences. We have an idea of ghetto that is quite misleading. Mitchell Dunayer in 2016 wrote a book entitled Ghetto, History of a Place and something History of an Idea. Especially among English-speaking people, when they think ghetto, they think about a very dangerous area, a suburb, in the periphery of a city, horrible and poor with minorities, whatever, stranger minorities, whatever, So this standard idea of ghetto has often been projected, backwards when thinking about the Italian ghettos. Italian ghettos were jails, that's for sure, where Jews were forced to leave. They were not given options. They had to live over there. But living in a ghetto doesn't mean that the Jews were unable to express their potentials and their talents. So Solomon Levy is not what we are expecting from a ghetto inhabitants in terms of places, in terms of talents, in terms of scholarship, in terms of social connections, in terms of social ability to become a real citizen, in terms of what they do and what they are able to afford. So this is in 2 sentences. Living in a ghetto was something more complicated than normally we think. Even when we remove the ghetto as a modern concept, we go to the historical concept of the early modern Italian ghettos, we too often go thinking about, okay, a ghetto was a place where the Jews were annihilated, basically, physically and mentally and spiritually. This is not true, of course. Maybe, I don't know if it's explained, summarized. Thanks to you. Thanks for your question. Thanks.
How was Jewish society organized in the Florentine ghetto? Were the merchants, shopkeepers, craftsmen, doctors, lawyers? Who were the Jews then?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. Very briefly, they were mostly living in the so-called second sector. They were not owners because they couldn't be owner. They couldn't own any real estate property. Okay, they were working on shops that. Officially, they were allowed to do only 2 professions: selling second-hand clothes, things or textiles, or importing things, second-hand, goodies from other cities. In any case, poor things, But they were mainly shop owners, unofficially or officially, depends. In some cases, we found doctors, physicians, but not that many. In the Florentine ghetto, we haven't found so far. It could be that in the next month we'll find more intellectuals or scholars. We found many people working in the internal Florentine trading net. They were very well connected with the Christians, collaborating with Christians and in the internal market. They are not international traders like Livorno Jews. They were mostly working in the second sector. Okay, local trade. Import-export sometimes, but mostly in the internal economy, I would say. With the making of the ghetto, the Jews were not allowed to lend money. So the Jewish bankers, disappeared. The money lenders disappeared with the making of the ghetto. We know that some were lending money unofficially to Christians, but it was just something that happened. So I would say like a middle class, mid and low middle class, sort of, straight layers is the people living in the Florentine Ghetto. But for the time being, it could be that the next year we'll find more. That is my vision for the time being, by the way. Yeah, we have a question over there first.
Somebody else? Me?
Sure.
Is it sensible to assume that Shakespeare in his play, The Merchant of Venice, is basically capturing everything that you talked about life in a city-state? Yeah. So they were not too, well, they were restricted, but like you said, they did develop mentally, they did progress, they did not remain like a peasant society.
Definitely. I haven't said at the beginning of my talk, it's wrote in my notes. I wanted to read from my note, but then I wanted to explain how the Jews in the Florentine Ghetto and in other Italian ghetto were able to turn limitations and interdictions into potential things, into talents and ways of overcoming the boundaries. Solomon Levy, once again, is an example. Is someone who, in spite of all limitations, is trying to reconstruct it in a sort of an intellectual social microcosm, in this case in his own house, because he's rich, because he's able to afford a beautiful apartment with a lot of rooms, okay? But this is one of the key features to understand the Italian Jewry in general. In spite of the limitation, or maybe because of the limitations and interdictions, Italian Jews were able to reinvent themselves and then to turn boundaries into perspectives. This is a very complicated question, but I would say philosophically I would explain Italian Jewry in this way, yeah.
Should we do the last question?
Sure.
Please correct me if I'm wrong, but based upon your research, which I greatly respect because I'm a scholar myself, it would seem to me that the Italian Jews, even though they had more freedom and they had a better life, but the majority were business people or tradespeople, in comparison to the Jews in the Germanic lands and all those little countries that form the greater part of United Germany today in the 20th century, over 100 years ago under Otto von Bismarck. Now, the Jews in Germany were able to move up the socioeconomic and political ladder very, very quickly because so many became court Jews, because they were money lenders to the princes and to whoever, and the aristocracy needed it. So my question is, even though the Jews in Italy had more freedom, what prevented them from taking these giant steps and making more strides in comparison to their Jewish brethren in the Germanic countries?
Well, let me answer your question very briefly because it's very complicated. I wouldn't say they had more freedom. They had more tolerance. Tolerance means to be tolerated. This is not such a nice concept. They were, tolerated, they could live in Italy, they could trade, they could coexist with the Christians, but their ability to climb the social hierarchy was, somehow limited. With the making of the unification of the country in 1861, when, the Jews were allowed to become citizens for the first time after, almost 2,000 years of, interdictions, they started climbing the hierarchy, becoming the secretaries of Cavour, the prime ministers, and the king, and becoming part of the court, of the, secular court of the Savoy family. Very quickly, they become industrials, they become business people, very quickly, in a few decades. That is a question. In Germany, or I don't want to say in Germany in general, I don't want to generalize, but like in Eastern Europe, remember, there is discrepancy between protection and, and non-protection. A shtetl is not a ghetto. A shtetl is it best, because there are no walls, there's no physical boundaries, or is it better to live in a ghetto? As a matter of fact, in Italy, we never had a pogrom, like in the shtetls, okay? Open villages in the middle of nowhere with Tsarist, troops or, anti-Semitic people were, killing the Jews by the thousand. This never happened in Italy. The ghettos, that's a dichotomy, of course. There's a discrepancy, something, dialectically difficult to understand. The Jews were segregated into the ghettos. They were walled inside the ghettos. but rarely we have events of, mass killings or massacres. These happen sometimes. We have, in the 18th century, when the ghettos started collapsing as a structure, political structure and a physical, series of boundaries, we had, the massacres in the south, we will see tomorrow, in the south part of Tuscany. At the end of the 18th century, with the, declining of the ghetto, some anti-Semitic people started, attacking physically the Jews because the doors were left opened, physically, the gates were opened. I don't want to say it was nice, it was a fun to live in the ghetto, but it was some sort of advantages of living over there. It's safety. It's tolerance. It's not freedom. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.